3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of censorship. So historically, when most people think about censorship, really people were thinking about government censorship. Because obviously we've all heard about the censorship that took place in places like the Soviet Union, under like Joseph Stalin, or under Mao Zedong in China, where governments were censoring the opinions of those that didn't support the government's propaganda. However, censorship can also take form in many other ways, from members of society, for example. Because if a group of people don't like what you have to say, there are things that they can do to try to get you to stop talking, either by threatening violence against you, by threatening to ruin your career by trying to get you fired from a job, or boycotting your work or more. And this is something that has gone on throughout human history as well. So there's government censorship, and then there's just sort of general societal censorship as well. For instance, going back to ancient Greece about 2,400 years ago, the famous philosopher Socrates was sentenced to death by his fellow Athenians because of his beliefs, which many people argued were corrupting the youth. And then moving into the 1500s, the monk Martin Luther would be deemed a heretic by the Catholic Church because of his criticism of the Catholic Church, which of course would lead to the Protestant Reformation, and the reason why there is all these Protestant churches today because of that split due to Martin Luther. And also there's another example that comes from more recent history in the 1940s and the 1950s in the United States. During the Cold War with the Soviet Union, you had this social hysteria regarding communism in American society, where people were so afraid of hidden communists secretly seeking to destroy the country that there were various people, not only in the government, obsessively looking for communists, regardless if they were there or not, but also just generally people in society that were, constantly trying to find excuses to accuse others of being a communist sympathizer. A major example of this came from Hollywood, where people literally were being fired and had their careers ended because of accusations towards them of being a communist, regardless if there is any evidence or not for them being a communist or a communist sympathizer. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't any Soviet spies in the U.S. Of course, there were during the Cold War. But the idea of going after random people with no connection to the Soviet Union for a political opinion, let's say that they are actually a communist or a socialist, or have just some sympathy towards the idea of being one, or just going after people who are not communist sympathizers at all, but just because someone decided one day that they looked like they could be, accusing these people and having their careers ruined, it really was a bad look for American democracy. Because if you disagree with someone, the main idea is to have, free-thinking, open discussions and dialogue with people you disagree with, not trying to go after them like a witch hunt. So this ultimately brings us to the world we live in today, where, if you haven't been aware, this sort of human nature of people developing these kind of one-dimensional analysis of political issues and having this tunnel vision towards those they don't agree with is still a major problem. Because today we still have lots of people assuming that anyone they disagree with is dangerous or a bad person and must be silenced. And this is unfortunately a problem that is haunting societies all over the world, but especially democracies in the West, for example, the United States and across Europe. Societies that have historically, in the modern era, been champions of free thought and free speech, but have also become very radically polarized in ways where you have competing groups that are very hostile towards people that don't conform to those groups' worldviews. And as a result, this has led to the rise of a term that many are probably familiar with called cancel culture. And so if you look around American society, we're really seeing this all the time now, where people are being boycotted by universities or fired from jobs and being threatened for their political opinions. Now, having a political opinion, regardless of how bad it is, it's protected speech under the First Amendment in the U.S. With that being said, a company can fire you if it's a private company. If you have an opinion that they think is bad for their business, they can fire you for it. That doesn't make it right. You should be firing people over opinions that have no impact or has nothing to do with your job. But for example, most people probably wouldn't raise a fuss if, let's say, a Nazi was fired from some company. That obviously would not be a good look for any company to be affiliated with Nazis or have Nazis working for them. But a Nazi, for example, under the First Amendment can, promote their hate speech in public and protest without being put in jail, because that speech is protected under the First Amendment. But what we're seeing today is not some crazy speech by Nazis or fascists, which are always criticized by people across the political spectrum. Instead, though, the opinions today that are drawing backlash are not opinions that are representative of a small fraction of lunatics in society, but instead are opinions that really represent the majority of people, or at least the majority of people are sympathetic to. For example, within the last decades, you had cases like the music group The Dixie Chicks, who criticized George Bush and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, who suffered boycotts for this all over the place from the right wing of the American political spectrum. And as a result, they lost sponsors and their music was no longer played on the radio because they were considered anti-American. Ironically, though, the vast majority of Americans today don't think George Bush was a good president and also thought the invasion of Iraq was a horrible decision. So it just goes to show how much things can change when it comes to what's considered the right view on an issue and sort of the cancel culture phenomena that can occur because of that. Next, there was also, in fairly recent years, in the late 2010s, there were calls to boycott the National Football League over players kneeling during the national anthem, for example. And this was another thing that was coming from the right wing of the political spectrum in the U.S., where, the idea of someone dishonoring the national anthem became a really big deal. And players who were doing this because obviously things like the Black Lives Matter movement. And so you had, all these different political things going on, and people were threatening to boycott the NFL because of it. And it became a really big issue. Though I will say it's always been a little odd for the national anthem to be played at sporting events all the time. I've been to a lot of different countries and at sporting events in a lot of different countries, and that is not a thing that people do in other places around the world. So there are some cultish-like aspects to playing the national anthem at every different sporting event. A lot of foreigners that come to the U.S. and see that also find it a little odd. The other thing, though, is that kneeling during the national anthem is part of someone's, free speech to do that. Though the NFL, being private, can do what they will with the players that do that. But at the same time, out of all things to do, it's really not that big of a deal. Pretty minor thing for people to get worked up for, especially considering that there are also lots of people that claim to be incredibly patriotic, but yet absolutely know nothing about American history, American democracy, because it's much easier to claim to be patriotic than to actually be patriotic in the first place. But that's just kind of human psychology in general. People become trained to accept something as kind of standard practice and the right thing to do, and kind of develop this cult-like mentality regarding it, which is a major common theme in cancel culture, and just kind of assumes that if others aren't doing it, it's because they're a bad person. So And this isn't really to justify people who were kneeling. Obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement has had many issues over the years, and more has come out about how that movement's had many problems with credibility, as well as the fact that, given that there also have been several claims of police brutality that turned out not to actually be police brutality. So that movement's had many issues as well, but that's the whole problem in general that we're talking about, is that people get into camps, they get attached to movements, whether it's this ultra-patriotic movement with a national anthem or the Black Lives Matter movement. And the problem with all movements is that they oftentimes take on a life of their own and become less worried about factual representation of things and more about you're either with me or against me, and you have to blindly support this idea or concept that they're promoting. And we all know that all political issues are way more complex than that. And that's the problem with cancel culture. So fast forwarding to even more recent events, we also had the author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, who has faced tremendous backlash for criticizing beliefs promoted by some trans activists, with Rowling arguing that identifying as a woman doesn't make you a woman. And obviously in today's culture wars, that is something that will definitely get you criticized, get boycotts for you, get death threats for you. And this was happening on the political left that was doing this to someone. So J.K. Rowling has had quite a bit of criticism from the left as a result of that, for stating something that still the majority of Americans believe. And finally, another example also from the left. So 2 examples from the left and 2 examples from the right here. The last example from the left, which really just happened recently, was at a small liberal arts college called Hamlin, where a university professor was actually fired for showing a picture depicting the Prophet Muhammad, which is pretty disturbing given that Hamlin is not an Islamic university, and also the fact that not all Muslims find that incredibly offensive, though the majority do, but also given the fact that the whole point of universities is to promote critical thinking, not to submit to the rules of a religion. However, colleges in general, as of late, have become some of the most intolerant places in the U.S., with opinions being censored or punished on campuses all across the country that are, ironically, also very common opinions amongst the general public in the U.S. So with that, cancel culture, though some may be skeptical, or may be skeptical only of cancel culture that goes against their political beliefs, is certainly a real issue in American society. Now, granted, I think cancel culture can definitely be overused as a term, but there's no question that it actually exists and is a major problem in a democratic society. Because again, firing people or boycotting them or threatening them for having an opinion that has nothing to do with their job, or is not only not controversial, but only upsets a very small segment of society that is fairly politically radical, is not helpful for a society that is supposedly based on the values of free inquiry, civil discourse, and freedom of speech. So with that, as always, remember, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.